In the spring of 1941, a Nazi propaganda broadcaster sat in a Hamburg studio and said something he intended to destroy 14,000 men. He told the Allied garrison holding a Libyan port city that they were caught like rats in a trap, that they would live like rats and die like rats, that they would be smoked out of their holes. The soldiers listening in the desert were supposed to feel what trapped animals feel. Instead, one of them spent several nights cutting the insult into the metal of a German bomber the garrison had shot down with captured German guns, shaped it into a medal, and wore it on his uniform. For 242 days, 14,000 Australians held a position that Germany's most celebrated armoured commander could not capture. And they did it under the name their enemy gave them as a contemptuous epitaph. Tell me in the comments. Had you ever heard of the rats of Tobruk before today? Because what you are about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about where courage comes from and what it costs. Now let's go. To understand why 14,000 Australians ended up trapped in a Libyan port city in the spring of 1941, you must first understand what the Mediterranean meant in that year and why it was the only theatre on earth where Britain was still fighting a land war at all. The calculation was simple and brutal. The Suez Canal was 60 miles of water running through Egypt that connected the British Empire's eastern and western halves. Lose the canal, and Britain could no longer reach India, Australia, Malaya, Burma, or New Zealand by the direct route. The empire could not function. The supply lines that fed the war effort and the imperial economy would have to travel thousands of additional miles around the Cape of Good Hope, adding months and tonnage to every voyage. This was not a diplomatic setback or a territorial loss to be absorbed and compensated for elsewhere. The loss of the Suez Canal was the physical impossibility of a British imperial war effort continuing on anything resembling its existing terms. Britain in 1941 was fighting alone. France had fallen in June of 1940. The United States was neutral, and Pearl Harbor was still 8 months away. The Luftwaffe had failed to establish air superiority over southern England. U-boats were attempting to strangle the Atlantic supply lines. Yugoslavia and Greece were falling to German invasion, and every other front was either a retreat, a siege, or an air battle. Britain was managing without winning. North Africa was the only place in the world where British and Commonwealth land forces could engage the German army directly. Not a distant war, but the only war Britain was fighting on land in the entire world. Against that background, the news from the Western Desert in the final weeks of 1940 and the opening months of 1941 had been almost impossibly good. General Richard O'Connor's Western Desert Force attacked the Italian army on the 9th of December 1940 with 36,000 men against a force 3 times that size. 9 Italian divisions were destroyed. 130,000 prisoners were taken. 500 miles of Libyan territory swept clear in 2 months. The 6th Australian Division led the advance, capturing the port of Tobruk on the 22nd of January 1941, taking 25,000 Italian prisoners in a single day. By mid-February, Italian military power in eastern Libya had been effectively erased. Britain appeared to have its only active land front under complete control. Then came the decision that unmade everything. British forces in North Africa were stripped and sent to Greece to counter the German invasion there. The 6th Division was withdrawn and dispatched to a campaign that would end in evacuation. The formation sent to replace it was the 9th Australian Division, newer, less trained, missing much of its own artillery, which had been left behind in Palestine. Not a battle-hardened force replacing a battle-hardened force, but a green formation filling the gap the better-prepared division had left behind. Into this position came General Lieutenant Erwin Rommel. Hitler, alarmed by the collapse of his Italian allies, dispatched the Deutsches Afrikakorps to Tripoli in February of 1941, under explicit orders to stabilize the front, not to advance. Rommel had been in North Africa for 3 weeks, when he decided the orders were someone else's problem. He would attack on the 31st of March. The British, reading their intelligence intercepts, had calculated he would not move until late May. That calculation cost them everything they had gained in 2 months of fighting, and nearly cost them the war. 8 days, 400 miles. 2 generals captured. The offensive Rommel launched on the 31st of March moved at a speed that made a coherent British response essentially impossible. His forces swept through El Agheila, Mersa Brega, Benghazi, 400 miles of Libyan desert in 8 days. On the 8th of April, at night, a staff car carrying the 2 most senior British generals in Libya drove into a German patrol. Both generals were captured. The entire British military leadership in Libya disappeared in a single accidental encounter. The 9th Australian Division had been in North Africa for weeks. Their artillery was still in Palestine. Their armoured cavalry was elsewhere. They were moving east, continuously, as fast as whatever transport they could find could carry them. Trucks, cars, commandeered vehicles, anything that moved. They called the retreat the Benghazi Handicap, which was the kind of name that only men with a particular relationship to catastrophe would give to a desperate scramble ahead of armoured pursuit. The 2nd 13th Infantry Battalion, a South Australian unit, became the first Australians to fight Germans in the war when they engaged Rommel's advance at Er Rejima in late March, briefly delaying the forward elements of the Afrikakorps before falling back with the rest. The 2nd 13th would file that engagement as the first entry in what would become a very long record. The bulk of the division reached Tobruk on the 7th of April. General Archibald Wavell, the British Theatre commander, delivered the single most consequential instruction of the campaign in the fewest possible words. Tobruk must be held. He pointed to a map. He listed the scattered remnants of British power across 450 miles of desert. Then he said, "There is nothing between you and Cairo." The afternoon of the 10th of April, Good Friday, brought the encirclement complete. German and Italian forces had sealed the last road. Tobruk was an island in enemy territory, with the Mediterranean at its back and 350,000 square miles of Axis-controlled desert on 3 sides. The plan, to the extent there was a plan, was to hold the perimeter while the British reorganized and came back. What that relief would require, and how long it would take, nobody standing inside the wire on that Good Friday evening yet understood. Rommel understood one thing clearly. He needed Tobruk. His supply lines stretched more than 900 miles from Tripoli, across terrain that provided neither shelter nor support. Without the port, his forces could not advance into Egypt. He had the momentum of a campaign that had driven 400 miles in 8 days. What he could not know was that the fortress he was about to assault had been held for decades by the wrong army, which had now been replaced by exactly the right one. There was nothing about Major General Leslie James Morshead's physical appearance that immediately conveyed what he was. Of middle height, trim in build, with a mild facial expression that visitors frequently misread as mildness of character, the man who would command the Tobruk garrison looked less like a general than like the schoolteacher he had been. Chester Wilmot, the war correspondent who observed him throughout the siege, rendered him simply. His whole doctrine was aggression. Morshead was born on the 18th of September 1889 in Ballarat, East Victoria, the 6th of 7 children of a Cornish gold miner who died when Leslie was young, leaving the family in poverty. He qualified at Melbourne Teachers College, became a schoolteacher and Cadet Corps commander, and in August of 1914 resigned his teaching position and enlisted in the 2nd Infantry Battalion as a private at the age of 24. He landed at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915, the first day. He was one of the only officers not to become a casualty at Lone Pine. He was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel at 26, the youngest colonel in the British Army at the time. He commanded the 33rd Australian Infantry Battalion at Messines, Passchendaele, Villers-Bretonneux, and Amiens, mentioned in dispatches 6 times. The Distinguished Service Order, the Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, the French Legion of Honor. His soldiers called him Ming the Merciless. The name came from the villain in the Flash Gordon science fiction serials of the 1930s. Morshead had a habit, when deep in thought, of squinting and stroking his chin in a way that apparently matched the villain's mannerisms precisely. The nickname was affectionate as much as sardonic. The discipline that generated it was real. His precise, incisive speech and the flint-like, piercing scrutiny that acutely conveyed impressions of authority, resoluteness and ruthlessness were qualities his men respected without finding comfortable. On the evening before the encirclement was complete, Morshead assembled his principal officers and told them the only thing that mattered. "There'll be no Dunkirk here," he said. "If we should have to get out, we shall fight our way out. There is to be no surrender and no retreat." He added the tactical corollary that would define the entire character of the defence. We should make no man's land our land. The men he commanded were not the veterans the situation perhaps required. The 9th Division was partially trained and under-equipped by design rather than by accident, its own artillery left in Palestine, its armoured elements elsewhere. Drawn from every Australian state, the battalions were composed overwhelmingly of citizen soldiers in the deepest possible sense. Farmers, shopkeepers, labourers, teachers who had been fitted with uniforms 8 or 10 months earlier, and shipped to a continent most of them had never seen. Their disadvantages were obvious. What was less obvious, and would take Rommel 8 months to fully appreciate, was that these disadvantages were not the most important thing about them. The fortress they occupied had been built by the Italians, a 50-kilometre outer perimeter, the Red Line, of anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, minefields, and 128 concrete strongpoints that could support one another and cover no man's land with machine gun fire. The Australians added a second blue line 3 kilometres inside, and a third inner green line still closer to the town. On the night the encirclement closed, Australian engineers laid 5,000 landmines along the perimeter. 5,000 mines in one night, under the threat of imminent assault. Morshead's tactical doctrine for the defence rested on 4 principles. No ground was to be yielded. The garrison was to dominate no man's land through extensive nightly deep patrolling. Defensive positions were to be continuously improved, and the defence was to be organised in depth, with a large mobile reserve held back for counterattack. The most critical element was the anti-tank protocol for the perimeter. If German tanks broke through the Red Line, the infantry was explicitly ordered not to retreat and not to engage the tanks. Let them through. Kill the infantry following them. Let the artillery destroy the tanks from depth. It was a tactical gamble that required the infantry to maintain their discipline and their nerve while armour rolled past their positions in the dark. Morshead had decided they would. The battle began at midday on Good Friday, the 11th of April, 1941. Rommel's initial probes against the southern perimeter were ill-conceived, underpowered, and directed at the strongest section of the defences. The artillery and the perimeter infantry repulsed them before the afternoon was finished. Rommel decided to wait 3 days, concentrate his armoured forces, and launch a properly organised assault. On the morning of Easter Monday, the 14th of April, 1941, before the attack had even begun, Rommel wrote a letter to his wife Lucy at their home in Wiener Neustadt. Dear Lou, today may well see the end of the Battle of Tobruk. The British were very stubborn and had a great deal of artillery. However, we'll bring it off. He was writing with the absolute confidence of a man whose forces had conquered Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, and Greece without a single defeat in land combat. He had never written a letter like that and been wrong. He sealed it, and the assault began. Approximately 40 German tanks with towed artillery and infantry following moved against the southern perimeter along the El Adem road before dawn. The leading elements breached the red line in darkness and drove more than a mile and a half through the outer defences. The German infantry began moving through the gap after the tanks. And then something happened that had never happened to a German armoured attack in 2 years of the Second World War. The Australian infantry on the red line stayed in their positions. They did not retreat. They did not engage the tanks. They engaged the German infantry following the tanks, cutting them off from the armour ahead, eliminating the supporting elements that gave the tanks their tactical effectiveness. The British and Australian 25-pounder artillery, positioned well to the rear, opened direct fire on the tanks at close range. The tanks, suddenly without their infantry and engaging well-sighted guns in depth, stopped. Then they withdrew. The breach in the red line closed behind them. A captured German soldier told his Australian captors, "I cannot understand you Australians. In Poland, France and Belgium, once the tanks got through, the soldiers took it for granted that they were beaten. But you are like demons. The tanks break through and your infantry still keep fighting." While the armoured battle was deciding itself to the south, a different engagement was occurring to the east. On the night of the 13th into the 14th of April, Easter Sunday night into Easter Monday morning, a German infiltration party of approximately 30 men had breached the perimeter wire near post R33. They established themselves inside the outer defences with at least 6 machine guns, mortars, and 2 small field pieces. Lieutenant Austin Mikel assembled a 7-man section for what was required. They would charge with bayonets. John Hurst Edmondson, known to his family as Jack, had been born on the 8th of October 1914 in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales, the only child of Joseph and Maud Edmondson. The family had moved to a farm near Liverpool when Jack was young, and he grew up working the land, organising the local agricultural show, developing a reputation as an exceptional rifle shot who had earned a national medal at 17. His mother Maud later described him as absolutely impossible to get him disturbed or ruffled in any way. I had never seen him in a temper in his whole but short life, a stickler for duty at all costs. He had served in the militia from March of 1939, enlisted in the 2nd to 17th Battalion on the 20th of May 1940, and sailed from Sydney for the Middle East on the 19th of October 1940. He was 26 years old. The charge covered the ground between the Australian position and the German infiltration party in the way bayonet charges cover ground, at speed, in darkness, without the possibility of orderly withdrawal once committed. Edmondson was shot through the neck during the advance, then through the stomach. He continued forward. He killed 1 German with his bayonet. Then Lieutenant Mikel found himself simultaneously engaged, his bayonet in 1 German, that German seizing him about the legs, while another attacked from behind. Mikel called for help. Edmondson came to him despite his wounds and killed both men. The surviving Germans withdrew. Edmondson was carried back to the Australian lines. He died in the early hours of the 14th of April, 1941. He was 26 years old. His mother Maud, at the farm near Liverpool, had made Jack a promise before he sailed. She would keep a diary of events on the farm while he was away, so that when he came home, they would have the record of the time he had missed. 4 days after the Easter action, she read a newspaper account of a bayonet charge at Tobruk, in which an unnamed lieutenant and corporal had been prominent figures. She sensed, with the particular certainty that mothers seem to develop about their only children, that the corporal was Jack. She began preparing a food parcel to send him. On Saturday, the official telegram arrived. She stopped writing in her diary. She never started again. The Victoria Cross was awarded posthumously in July of 1941, the first Victoria Cross given to any Australian in the Second World War. The medal was presented to Maud Edmondson by the Governor-General at Admiralty House, Sydney, on the 27th of September, 1941. Her response, when asked about the honour: "Of course I am proud of him. I have always been proud of him. In a way, this great honour seems futile. I would rather have my son." What the Easter Battle had demonstrated was the decisive tactical insight that the Tobruk garrison had discovered under fire. The German armoured doctrine that had consumed Poland, France, and the Low Countries depended on the integration of infantry and tanks as an inseparable system. Strip the infantry from the tanks. Hold the perimeter positions. Register the artillery on the ground behind the breach. The tanks, moving without their infantry into a prepared killing zone, would stop. Rommel had written his letter to Lucy before the battle because he had never needed to write it afterward. After the 14th of April, 1941, he understood that the letter would have been wrong. When a military commander cannot break a position by direct assault, the next instrument available to him is the erosion of the will to resist. The Nazis had developed this instrument carefully across 5 years of political operation before the war and 2 years of military operation during it. Radio Berlin broadcast in English every night, aimed at Allied soldiers and the British public simultaneously, carrying a precisely calibrated blend of accurate intelligence, deliberate misinformation, and targeted personal contempt. The man most closely associated with those broadcasts was William Joyce, American-born, Irish-raised, and operating from Hamburg after fleeing Britain on a fraudulently acquired British passport in August of 1939. He was not the original Lord Haw-Haw. That nickname had been applied to another broadcaster first, but Joyce absorbed it and made it definitively his own, opening every program with Germany calling, Germany calling, in an affected upper-class English accent. After the war, the instrument of his conviction for treason was the fraudulently acquired passport. His own contempt for legality provided the legal basis for his execution on the 3rd of January, 1946. But in the spring of 1941, his voice carried across the desert every night, and the garrison at Tobruk was one of his most specific targets. The logic of what he broadcast about the men in Tobruk was the same logic that had worked everywhere else his voice had been aimed. Make them feel what the situation suggested they should feel. Isolated, forgotten, verminous, doomed. Joyce told his audience that the men defending Tobruk were caught like rats in a trap. He called them poor desert rats of Tobruk, who live like rats and will die like rats. He promised they would be smoked out of their holes. In Poland, France and Belgium, this language directed at men already in retreat had accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish. Tobruk was the first place it did not. They laughed. The specific quality of Australian sardonic humour, the cultural reflex that encounters the worst possible thing, and finds in it, with no apparent effort, the best possible joke, met Joyce's contempt and converted it in the time it takes to hear a sentence and recognise its comic possibilities. The garrison began calling themselves the Rats of Tobruk, not defensively and not with reluctant acceptance, but with immediate and total ownership of the name. The Tobruk Truth, the daily garrison newspaper produced by Lance Sergeant William Henry Williams, a Melbourne journalist serving with the AIF Military History Section, continued publishing even after a 1,500-pound bomb landed on the building where it was printed. It embraced the name without qualification. Men who had been farmers and labourers and shopkeepers 3 years earlier claimed a Nazi propaganda epitaph as their permanent identity within days of hearing it broadcast. The propagandist had miscalculated his audience with a comprehensiveness that history rarely provides. Then one of them made a medal. Corporal Leslie Harold Dufton worked over several nights using the aluminium salvaged from a German bomber the garrison had shot down with captured German anti-aircraft guns to fabricate the first unofficial Rat of Tobruk medals. The image of a rat stamped onto metal, cut from the aircraft that tried to kill them, made using the weapons of the force doing the killing, worn as a badge not of the institution that sent them to Tobruk, but of themselves, of what they had decided their experience there meant. What Dufton made over those nights was not a souvenir. It was an argument, assembled from scrap and worn on the chest, about who held the moral authority in the exchange between the garrison and the man in Hamburg who had called them vermin. Joyce was not finished. When the Australians' aggressive night patrols began stripping the surrounding positions of intelligence, prisoners and supplies, with a systematic efficiency that Rommel's command found genuinely alarming, he reached for a second insult. Morshead became Ali Baba Morshead and his 20,000 thieves. This too was adopted with satisfaction. The scoring system for Lord Haw-Haw's broadcasts from inside the perimeter was simple. Every insult landed was a point for the garrison. They were winning comprehensively. 50 years later, when the Royal Mint of Australia struck a commemorative medallion for the anniversary of the siege, the thing it commemorated was the name William Joyce had broadcast as a death sentence in the spring of 1941. The man who gave them that name was hanged for treason in January of 1946. The name he gave them outlasted him by decades and is still being carried today. A name, though, even a name as good as this one, does not hold a perimeter. From the first day, Morshead told Chester Wilmot during the siege, "I determined that no man's land would be our land." The sentence was not a sentiment. It was a tactical directive with specific operational requirements, which had to be fulfilled every night, regardless of what the preceding night had cost, regardless of weather or exhaustion, or the particular condition of the men going out. What it looked like in practice was 10 to 20 men armed with Bren guns, Thompson submachine guns, rifles, bayonets and grenades moving beyond the perimeter wire after dark, one man with a compass, one counting paces in the featureless desert. Reconnaissance patrols gathered intelligence on enemy positions, unit dispositions, minefield layouts. Fighting patrols operated under the simplest of all possible orders. Do as much damage as you can without getting caught. The damage accumulated. In July of 1941 alone, Australian patrols killed 180 enemy troops and wounded more than 230. The men who were supposed to be besieging the garrison had become afraid to go out at night. The garrison that was supposed to feel trapped had made the surrounding desert its operational territory. Inside the perimeter, the conditions the garrison lived in did not improve with time. 1 bottle of water per day per man, for drinking, for washing, for whatever purposes water serves in the desert. Water supply trucks ran only at night because their engine noise drew enemy artillery, and the water itself was frequently warm and brackish. Temperatures reached 40 degrees Celsius during the summer months. The Khamsin, a hot desert wind that could reach 140 kilometers per hour, swept through periodically, filling weapons and machinery with sand, reducing visibility to nothing. Desert sores, dysentery, lice. Flies in numbers that one Royal Artillery battery sergeant described as obviously in the pay of the enemy. Chaplain Owen Cosgriff, a Catholic priest serving as garrison chaplain, wrote in his diary on the 20th of July, 1941, 5 a.m. blitz as usual. Regular occurrence now even with no moon, but helped by shells. Usual 3 masses, with raids on the way to the church and during Mass. Poor crowd and church described as death trap by one lad. The Church of St. Anthony was eventually deemed structurally unsafe by the engineers. Cosgriff stopped using it. He kept saying Mass. Every night, the German military radio station broadcast Lael Anderson singing Lily Marlene, a song about a soldier's sweetheart waiting beneath the lamplight outside a barracks gate. It became the unofficial anthem of every soldier in the Western Desert, regardless of nationality, regardless of which side of the wire they occupied. The Germans shelling the garrison listened to it. The Australians going out to kill the Germans listened to it. It floated across no man's land in both directions simultaneously, touching the siege with a quality of shared human loss that sits permanently outside the capacity of military language to acknowledge. Then came the 30th of April. After the Easter defeat, Rommel waited 3 weeks. He brought up the freshly arrived 15th Panzer Division, reorganized his assault forces, and at 6:30 in the evening launched the largest coordinated attack yet attempted against the perimeter. Stukas pounded the defences in waves. Artillery hammered the southwestern corner of the Red Line. Then panzers and grenadier units surged forward simultaneously, striking a section of the perimeter that the weight of the assault had pushed beyond its capacity to hold. By the morning of the 1st of May, Rommel had achieved what the Easter battle had denied him: a permanent breach. The pocket he had created was 5.5 kilometres wide and 4 kilometres deep. The high ground at Ras El Medawa, Hill 209, was in German hands. From that elevation, enemy observers could see directly into the garrison's interior, watching the movement of vehicles and men, registering positions that had been invisible from the flat desert outside the wire. Morshead launched a counterattack in June. It was repulsed with heavy losses. He launched another in August. Repulsed again. The ground was never recovered. The men holding the line adjacent to what became known as the salient lived in conditions that defied the language used to describe even ordinary siege positions. Corporal Geoffrey Lowe of the 2nd 12th Battalion put it with the specificity that only direct experience produces. You couldn't move in daytime, you'd be shot. In some places along the salient, only a few hundred metres separated the German and Australian front lines. The artillery that both sides maintained on the salient's shoulders made movement in daylight suicidal and movement at night, the constant probability of contact at ranges measured in steps. The salient never closed. For the rest of the siege, it sat in the southwestern perimeter as the permanent mark of the one moment Rommel's persistence had produced a lasting result. The open wound of the siege, present from May, still bleeding when the last soldiers left in December. The garrison's continued existence depended, at every moment and without interruption, on a thread of dark water connecting Tobruk harbour to Alexandria, 300 miles to the east. 36,000 people inside the perimeter needed to be fed, medicated, armed, and reinforced continuously. There was no other route. The Luftwaffe and the Italian Regia Aeronautica had their own name for the approach to Tobruk harbour: Bomb Alley. German and Italian aircraft flew 3,000 sorties against the harbour and its approaches during approximately 750 raids across the siege. The Royal Navy and the Royal Australian Navy flew their ships through all of it. The RAN destroyers on the supply run, HMIS Stuart, Voyager, Vampire, Vendetta, Waterhen, Napier, Nizam, became known collectively as the Scrap Iron Flotilla, which was the kind of name the RAN gave its most important assets when it wanted to suggest that the importance wasn't the point. Bob Semple, a veteran of the 2nd 12th Field Artillery Regiment who went in on those ships, said afterward, "We shall ever be grateful to our Navy, the destroyers and those ships, that supported and kept us alive, because without the Navy, we would not have seen out the distance. The Vampire, Vendetta, Waterhen. These vessels did countless runs, and they came in on the phases of the moon at night, into the harbour, to get in and dump whatever they had. Gratitude from a man who does not use the word extravagantly is a specific kind of testimony. On the 30th of June, 1941, HMS Waterhen was sunk in Bomb Alley on a supply run, the first Royal Australian Navy warship lost in the Second World War. Between April and December of 1941, 34 ships were sunk and 33 more damaged. 62 vessels in total sunk or damaged across the entire supply operation. The harbour never closed. That fact, stated without elaboration, is the summary in one sentence of what the naval operation achieved and what it cost. On the 28th of April, 1941, the garrison had been told to expect relief within 8 weeks. The calendar reached the end of those 8 weeks in late June. The men inside the wire noted this: the particular way soldiers note a promise that has expired without being kept, quietly, without apparent discussion, and continued doing what the situation required. No second announcement about timelines was made. The British had been attempting to reach them. Operation Brevity, launched on the 15th of May, sent a small force against the frontier positions at Halfaya, Sollum and Capuzzo. It recovered those positions in 2 days of fighting. Rommel retook them within a fortnight. The garrison remained surrounded. Operation Battleaxe, launched on the 15th of June, was a considerably larger effort. 300 newly shipped tanks committed to the offensive. The operation lasted 3 days. Rommel's forces, anchored by 88mm anti-aircraft guns, turned against armour at the Hellfire Pass. A position the men fighting there called Hellfire Pass destroyed the British tanks in disciplined lines. Nearly 100 were lost. General Wavell was replaced by General Sir Claude Auchinleck. Tobruk was still surrounded. The men inside had been promised 8 weeks. They were entering their 4th month. By August, something had to give. That month, Morshead had delivered a formal assessment to medical authorities and to his superior, General Sir Thomas Blamey, the commander of the 2nd Australian Imperial Force. It was not an expression of doubt about the garrison's courage. It was a medical and military fact. The men who had held Tobruk for 5 months were deteriorating physically, to the point where their capacity to sustain another major coordinated Axis assault was genuinely in question. They were underfed, overworked, chronically sleep-deprived, and carrying the accumulated physiological debt of continuous combat stress across a period far beyond what any operational plan had anticipated. Morshead was not asking to abandon the position. He was reporting what 5 months of that position had cost. General Blamey took the assessment to Auchinleck and then to Canberra. The argument had 2 distinct components. The military case was Morshead's. The men were spent, and a fresh garrison would hold Tobruk more effectively. The constitutional case was older and in some respects more forceful. The original agreement between the Australian and British governments specified that Australian divisions would serve together under Australian command. The 9th Division had been fighting independently within a British operational structure for months beyond its intended commitment, in a theatre not of Australia's primary strategic concern, under conditions promised to resolve themselves within 8 weeks. Winston Churchill was furious. He needed Tobruk to hold, and he needed these specific men because their demonstrated fighting record gave him a confidence in the garrison's stability that no fresh formation without that record could provide. He communicated his position directly to the Australian government. He was not making a request. Arthur Fadden, Australia's Prime Minister, declined. His successor John Curtin, who replaced Fadden in October of 1941, also declined. The men were deteriorating. The commitment had exceeded its stated terms. They would be relieved. The extraction began in August. The 18th Brigade was the first formation to go, replaced by the Polish Carpathian Brigade, veterans of considerable experience, many of them soldiers who had escaped through Romania after Poland fell in September of 1939. The rest of the 9th Division followed in September and October, each convoy running bomb alley in darkness, each run a recalculation of risk against necessity. On the final scheduled evacuation convoy, an air attack forced the ships to turn back before the last remaining Australian battalion could be lifted out. The 2nd 13th Infantry Battalion, the South Australian unit that had fought the first Australian engagement against Germans at Iwo Jima in March, could not get on the ships. They remained. By November of 1941, they were the only Australian unit that had been continuously present in Tobruk since the siege began. Operation Crusader, the third attempt to end it from outside, was 3 weeks away. The British 8th Army that crossed the start line on the 18th of November 1941 was not the force that had failed at Brevity and Battle Axe. 770 tanks, including new American Stuart light tanks, supported by more than 700 frontline aircraft. The plan required two things to happen simultaneously: armoured forces swinging wide through the desert to engage Rommel's panzer divisions, while the Tobruk garrison broke out from the inside to link up with the relief force at Ed Duda Ridge, southeast of the town. What happened in the first week bore little resemblance to the plan. The dispersal of British armoured units across the desert in the opening days led to 530 tank losses. On the 23rd of November, the 5th South African Brigade was effectively destroyed at Sidi Redzig. Rommel responded not by contracting his lines, but by attacking, driving toward the Egyptian frontier in a bold thrust designed to collapse the 8th Army's supply lines from the rear. For several days, the western desert descended into a confusion bordering on the chaotic, with forces from both sides intermixed across hundreds of miles of desert. And yet, on the 27th of November, New Zealand forces advanced to Ed Duda Ridge, south of Tobruk, and linked up with the garrison. The encirclement that had begun on the 10th of April, 231 days earlier, was broken. Tobruk was no longer surrounded. The men who met the New Zealanders at Ed Duda included the 2nd 13th Battalion. These were soldiers who had been in Tobruk since April, who had fought through the Easter battle and the long months of the patrolling war, who had watched the rest of the 9th Division evacuate in the autumn while they stayed. And they participated in the fighting to take and then hold Ed Duda Ridge, a night bayonet attack to capture it, followed by 2 days under continuous heavy artillery bombardment. Private Arthur Armstrong, who was there, we were shelled continually for 2 days. It was terrible. I can't describe it. These were men who had been shelled for 8 months, and for whom terrible retained its precise meaning. HMS Parramatta was lost on the 27th of November, 1941, sunk during the Crusader operation's opening weeks. On the same day, the encirclement broke. The Tobruk ferry was still paying its price on the day the siege effectively ended. The 7th of December, 1941, brought Rommel's decision. Unable to sustain the siege against Operation Crusader's growing pressure, he ordered the withdrawal to the Gazala position. 242 days after the encirclement closed, the siege of Tobruk was over. That same 7th of December, Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the war. Australia's strategic situation transformed in hours, and the 9th Division that had been extracted from Tobruk over Churchill's objections would soon be needed to defend the continent that had sent it. The two facts shared a calendar square without any designed relationship, which is how history tends to arrange its most significant coincidences. The accounting of what the siege had been worth could now be rendered. Rommel's supply lines had been forced inland around Tobruk for 8 months. bleeding his logistical capacity at a period when his entire operational position was defined by the distance between his forward forces and the bases stretched out behind them. 4 Italian divisions and 3 German battalions, a besieging force roughly twice the size of the garrison, had been pinned in position instead of advancing. The Suez Canal had not fallen. Egypt had not fallen. These were not incidental benefits. They were the reason men had been sent to die in that perimeter, and the deaths had purchased what was intended. What the garrison of Tobruk proved, in the spring and summer of 1941, was something that required proof. The armoured assault tactics which had consumed a continent depended on the integration of infantry and tanks as an inseparable system. Strip the infantry, hold the perimeter. Register the artillery on the ground behind the breach. The tanks, moving without their supporting infantry into a prepared killing zone, would stop. This formula had been executed under fire, for the first time at that scale, by formations that had never done it in combat before. 40 years after the battle, the United States Army Command and a General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth produced a formal analysis of the Easter engagement, specifically because the tactical principles Morshead had applied retained relevance to questions of how infantry formations could defend against armoured assault. The mathematics of Tobruk remained valid long after the desert had returned to its ordinary silence. Morshead and the 9th Division went to Syria after the evacuation. They came back. In October of 1942, at the Second Battle of El Alamein, General Bernard Montgomery positioned them in the crucial northern coastal sector and assigned them the most demanding role on the entire front. Absorb the German and Italian counterattacks, draw the pressure of Rommel's armour onto the division's positions, and hold it there while the breakthrough was achieved further south. His assessment afterward was direct. I do not know of any other Allied division who could have done it. The men Rommel could not break at Tobruk were the men Montgomery used to help break Rommel at Alamein. After Tobruk, the 9th Division adopted a new divisional colour patch in the shape of the letter T, worn across all its constituent battalions as a permanent mark of their shared ordeal. Not imposed from above. Not issued as a uniform requirement. Chosen and worn with a uniformity that made the choice indistinguishable from a requirement. A letter whose meaning needed no explanation to anyone who had been there. On the 21st of June, 1942, Rommel took Tobruk. He took it in less than 24 hours. The garrison was largely South African, under a commander without Morshead's experience, defending a perimeter stripped of the minefields and wire that had been repositioned further west. Hitler promoted Rommel to Field Marshal on the news. Winston Churchill, who received the message while meeting with President Roosevelt in Washington, called it one of the heaviest blows of the war. The 9th Division was in Syria when the news arrived. What they said about it, privately, the historical record does not fully disclose. On the 22nd of March, 1944, the original members of the garrison formed the North Bondi sub-branch of the Returned and Services League of Australia, known ever after as the Rat House. While the war was still being fought, director Charles Chauvel began production of The Rats of Tobruk, a film starring Peter Finch and Chips Rafferty. The name Joyce had coined in Hamburg as a contemptuous dismissal of trapped men had become, within 3 years of the broadcast, the title of a motion picture celebrating the same men. In 1969, Maud Edmondson donated her son, Jack's Victoria Cross, his medals, and some of his personal belongings to the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. He had been dead for 28 years. She had stopped writing in her diary when the telegram arrived in April of 1941, and had never started again. The diary that was supposed to give Jack the record of what he had missed while he was away exists in the archive as a document with an abrupt ending, which is an accurate description of everything it records. Streets in Canberra and Sydney carry Edmondson's name today. a high school in the Horningsea Park district, an RSL club in Liverpool, a rest area on the Remembrance Driveway between Sydney and Canberra, a suburb of Sydney, the first Australian to receive the Victoria Cross in the Second World War, a farm worker from New South Wales who died at 26 years old in a bayonet charge in the dark, is embedded in the ordinary geography of the country he came from, in the way that countries embed the people they cannot adequately honour, but cannot bring themselves to forget. William Joyce sat in his Hamburg studio in the spring of 1941 and looked for a word that would break 14,000 men. He found one. It was the wrong word for that particular audience, and the distance between those two facts is the distance in which the real history of the Tobruk siege is written. 242 days. 14,000 Australians in a desert perimeter that Germany's foremost armoured commander could not take. They compelled Rommel to reroute his supplies through 50 additional miles of open desert for every one of those days. They tied down a besieging force twice their own strength. They proved that the armoured assault which had consumed a continent could be stopped by infantry that refused to acknowledge what was supposed to happen when the tanks came through the wire. They produced the first Victoria Cross of Australia's Second World War in a 7-man bayonet charge against 30, the first entry in a record whose completeness nobody would have chosen. Jack Edmondson never came home to Liverpool. Maud Edmondson never finished the diary she had promised to keep for him. The last rat died in August of 2024, carrying a name an enemy broadcaster gave him as a sentence, and keeping it across 83 years of peacetime as the most significant thing he had ever been called. The medal Corporal Dufton, made from the wreckage of a German aircraft, cut from the machine that tried to kill the men who wore it, bearing the image of the thing their enemy had called them, is what the siege of Tobruk looks like when you hold it in your hand. If you believe those men deserve to be remembered, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand what happened when Australia ran out of time to fight someone else's war, watch this next.